This story sounds like it was pulled straight out of an apocalypse movie, except it really happened. And the scary part is, it could happen again today. A man named Ephraim Chay woke up feeling groggy and confused. As he lay in his bed inside of his small mud brick house perched up on a cliff, he tried to remember what happened the night before. He couldn't quite piece together what had happened the day or night before. However, there was one thing he distinctly remembered. He had heard one really loud boom of thunder outside. And then Ephraim, no matter how hard he focused, he couldn't really remember how much time passed after hearing that booming sound, being in his bed, and feeling kind of sick. And so that morning, he rolled over and he looked out the window, and he saw the sky was clear and the grass was totally dry. There was no indication that it had rained anytime recently. The second Ephraim began to move in his house, it was like his body didn't obey his mind. Because moments later, instead of checking on his kids, Ephraim had wandered out his front door and was just standing out in front of his house, just kind of staring off into the distance, having no idea why he walked out there. The village where Ephraim lived was called Nios, and Nios is extremely rural. The village is actually split into two parts. There's Upper Nios and Lower Nios. Ephraim lived in Upper Nios, right near this big, beautiful lake called Lake Nyos, but the majority of villagers lived in Lower Nios, which was below the lake. He began looking around in hopes that other people would be out and about in Upper Nios, where he lived, so he could go talk to them and try to figure out what was wrong with him. But as he scanned around Upper Nios, he saw there was not another soul anywhere. He would just start walking down towards Lower Nios to try to talk to someone down there. After Ephraim got about halfway down this hill, right when he was near Lake Nyos, he stopped because suddenly he became totally aware of the fact that the world was totally silent. Even the mosquitoes that were a totally annoying constant in Ephraim's life were gone. And as Ephraim is looking around, wondering what is going on here, he hears off to his right, over near the lake, a woman shrieking at the top of her lungs. And he saw there was this woman about 100 feet away. She was a local, and she was looking right at Ephraim, and she was barely dressed, and she was ripping the rest of her clothes off, and she was just screaming. And so, acting on instinct, Ephraim immediately turned and just started running towards this woman. And as he's bounding towards her, getting closer and closer, he's starting to notice there's these strange shapes on the ground kind of near this woman. But as he was staring at them, he just couldn't quite place what they were. But when he got about 20 feet away from this shrieking woman, he stopped again because he realized the shapes on the ground were this woman's entire family. They were all just laying on the ground as if they were sleeping. And so, with panic starting to rise inside of Ephraim, he began to run at full speed, hoping that when he turned the corner, he would see the people he was hoping he would see. But all he saw were dead animals everywhere. They completely covered the streets, the sidewalk, everything. And so at this point, Ephraim was so desperate to see another person that he kept his eyes looking straight ahead and just ran straight into Lower Nios. And he turned towards the first hut he saw, and he ripped the door open and he stepped inside. And as soon as he did, he just stopped, because on the ground right in front of him was a woman who was very clearly deceased, just laying in the middle of the floor. She had a bowl of corn right near her hand, as if she had been eating and then just fell dead. Her whole family, they were dead too. At this, Ephraim kind of stumbled backwards out of the hut, and then he turned around to face the road he had just been on with all the animals. And when he saw the road again, it was like a piece of his brain started working properly again, because he realized those weren't animal bodies. All those bodies he saw when he came in, those were people. There were no markings or cuts or wounds on any of these people. And then way down the road up ahead, he sees there are two people coming towards him. There's a man and what looks like his son, and they're jogging down the road, stumbling over bodies, running towards Ephraim. And so Ephraim stops, expecting these people are going to stop and talk to him. But as these two people got closer, Ephraim saw both of them, the father and the son, their eyes were wide, and they were looking straight ahead with kind of a distant 1,000-yard stare, and they didn't even stop for a second for Ephraim. It was like they didn't even see him. And then at some point, they veered off the road and ran into the forest and disappeared. He suddenly had this memory come flooding back into his mind. And it was a memory of when he was a kid and his grandfather told him a story. And the story was about Nios villagers a long, long time ago who decided they wanted to cross Lake Nyos from one side to the other. And so their leader magically parted the waters of Lake Nyos, creating a walkway on the lake bed from one side to the other, and the villagers began to walk. And then, about halfway across, a mosquito landed on the leader's shoulder, and when he went to slap the mosquito, he lost control of the waters, and they came crashing down and drowned all of them. Ephraim's grandfather told Ephraim that the ghosts of these drowned villagers now resided between these two big rocks located near Lower Nios. And so growing up, Ephraim believed that because of these ghosts, Lower Nios must be haunted. And in fact, that was actually why Ephraim built his house in Upper Nios. He thinks to himself, of course, all of this is the work of those ghosts. And so fearing he would be attacked next, Ephraim turned and just continued running down the road, dodging bodies as he went. After running for quite a while, Ephraim turned to go into yet another hut, and right as he reached for the door opened on its own. And standing in front of him was the owner of this hut. His name was Joseph N'Quain, and he was in much worse shape than Ephraim. The night before, Joseph had been inside of his hut when suddenly outside he heard that very loud booming sound, and then after hearing the sound, Joseph heard his daughter in her bed making this terrible snoring sound. And so instinctively, Joseph turned to walk over to his daughter to make sure she was okay, but he only got a few steps before he collapsed to the ground. He had woken up that morning with cuts all over his arms from where he fell, and he was also totally exhausted and very confused like Ephraim, and so he managed to drag himself over to his daughter's bed, and he pulled himself up onto her bed, and when he got up there, he realized his daughter was deceased. And so now, Joseph has opened the door, and he's looking out, and there's all these dead people everywhere, and Ephraim is looking back at him, and Joseph just can't process anything. He's just standing there in a total daze, and Ephraim, he wanted to say something, but no words could come out, and so he too just stood there looking at Joseph, until finally they both just extended their hands and shook silently, and then Ephraim turned around and ran back into the road. And so Joseph at first followed Ephraim kind of out of instinct, but very quickly he veered off from Ephraim, and Joseph went into his neighbor's hut to see if they were okay. All of his neighbors were deceased. After seeing all of his neighbors dead, somewhere deep down inside of his consciousness, Joseph knew he had to go find help. He climbed onto his motorcycle and he started to drive. It took Joseph a long time to drive to the next closest village, but when he got there, there were people and they were all alive. The things he was talking about, an entire village just suddenly dying, sounded crazy. And so nobody at this other village took Joseph seriously, and so that day, nobody from this other village went to Nios to see what was going on. But the next day, people from this other village did go to Nios, and when they got there, it was exactly as Joseph had said. The whole village was dead. And as authorities would soon find out, it was not just Nios that was affected by this tragic event. Several villages not far from Nios had also suffered mass casualty events on the morning of August 22nd, 1986. And soon, news of these strange mass death events in West Africa were making the news all over the world. 3 days after this terrible event, an American scientist named Joseph Devine turned on his TV and saw the news coming out of West Africa. And Devine is just staring at his TV in shock, and then he turns, runs to his phone, and he calls his contact at the US government and told them, "You gotta send me to Nios." And because his contact knew Devine's background, he immediately said, "Yes, I'll get you on a flight as soon as we can." Devine and his scientific partner, Haraldur Sigurdsson, arrived in Nios 2 days later on August 27th. When they got there, they saw the military was burying the dead in these huge mass graves, and looking on were the few survivors of this event, like Joseph and Ephraim, along with Ephraim's family, as well as other villagers who had come to see what happened. And so as Devine and Sigurdsson kind of maneuver their way through this crowd of very solemn people, they heard them talking about what they thought happened to all these people. And the theory theories ranged from secret governmental experiments to invisible superweapons to even atomic explosions. Others, like Ephraim, believed this was paranormal, that those ghosts from the drowned villagers had attacked the village. But Devine and Sigurdsson were reasonably sure that none of those theories were correct. They felt like they did know what actually happened because they had actually witnessed a tragedy like this before, but on a much smaller scale. 2 years earlier, and 60 miles south of Nios, in an area called Lake Nyos, 37 people suddenly dropped dead, and Devine and Sigurdsson had been sent out there to try to figure out what happened to these people, and after lots of experimentation, they came up with a theory that explained what happened, and they called it Unnatural Hazard. They tried to warn people in the area that this could happen again, and in fact, Sigurdsson had written an entire scientific paper about this theory and submitted it to a prestigious science journal, but nobody took Devine or Sigurdsson seriously. What they were proposing sounded made up, it sounded preposterous. But now, in Nios, it looked very much like their unnatural hazard had happened again. Devine and Sigurdsson would leave the group of people watching this mass burying take place, and they would make their way up the hill to Lake Nyos, where they would immediately get to work taking water samples from deep inside the lake. And after capping these samples, the lids began popping off, and that was the moment that Devine and Sigurdsson knew their unnatural hazard theory had to be correct. Lake Nyos is not your typical lake. It is a crater lake, which means it sits inside of a volcanic crater, which is a big, deep, bowl-like pit that was formed from a past volcanic explosion. And because of this volcanic activity, there is carbon dioxide in Lake Nyos. A lot of carbon dioxide. And if you breathe in a ton of CO2, you're dead. The CO2 in Lake Nyos had been trapped at the bottom of the lake for as long as anyone knew. But on the night of August 21st, 1986, something happened that caused that trapped gas to be released. On that night, Ephraim recalled hearing what he thought was thunder outside. Maybe it was the sound of a rock slide, and big rocks plummeted into the lake and hit the lake bottom and freed the gas that way. Or maybe it was just an actual volcanic eruption inside of the lake. Whatever it was, when the CO2 was freed, it bubbled to the top like it bubbled and popped off the lids of their sample tubes, and when it reached the top of the water, it kind of formed a cloud above the lake. And when this big toxic cloud began coming in contact with people, with animals, and insects, virtually all of them died. As for the few who survived, they were left feeling horribly confused, disoriented, nauseous, totally dizzy from CO2 poisoning. But when they finally were able to get away from Nios and breathe fresh air, the effects of CO2 poisoning wore off and they were okay. This deadly CO2 phenomenon was exactly what happened on a much smaller scale 2 years earlier at Lake Nyos. The official death toll of the Lake Nyos disaster was more than 1,700 people and more than 3,500 livestock, although exact numbers will likely never be known. Today, people have moved back into Upper and Lower Nios, including Ephraim, despite the fact that authorities have said that lake is still very dangerous and another unnatural hazard, aka a CO2 disaster, could absolutely happen again.